Fall is all about cozy comforts, and with Hero Bread, you can enjoy all your favorites and still hit your health goals. From breakfast bagels and meal prepped enchiladas to mouth-watering burgers and cheesy noodles. You won't believe Hero Bread's options have 0 to 5 grams net carbs and are high fiber from the taste and texture. And right now, Hero Bread is offering 10% off your order. Go to hero.co and use code FALL25 at checkout. That's FALL25 at HERO.co. All figures are per serving of Hero Bread. Contains 2 to 18 grams of fat per serving. See the product nutrition panels on hero.co for more information.
Life is unpredictable, but preparing for the unexpected shouldn't be. Take ownership of your life planning with Policy Genius to help your loved ones have a financial safety net in case something happens to you. They offer life insurance policies starting at just $276 a year for $1 million in coverage. Don't wait for life to make other plans. Protect your family today. Head to PolicyGenius.com. That's PolicyGenius.com.
Here in the United States, the classic example of an ill-fated attack, one that was doomed from the start, one that never should have happened in the first place, is usually Pickett's charge on July 3rd, 1863 at Gettysburg. I've stood on that field, as I know many others have, and just tried to imagine 15,000 men stretched out from end to end, marching over a mile of open ground into the face of enemy long-range artillery fire, and then as they got closer, enemy canister fire that ripped huge holes in the line, and then small arms fire at a couple hundred yards. And by the time that assault was over, something like 50% or more of the Confederates who stepped off from Seminary Ridge had fallen in those fields in front of the Union Center that day. But it was only when I traveled to France a few months ago and stood on these open, empty farm fields at a place called the Somme that I understood what hell must have really been like on the battlefield. July 1st, 1916 is generally understood to be the deadliest day in the history of the British military. That was the day that the opening assault was made along the Somme River. It was the place where the British and French lines came together on the Western Front of the Great War. And so that was the place where the joint British and French assault was planned to take place. The problem was that the Germans launched an assault of their own a few months earlier on the French city of Verdun, and that took away from a lot of what the French had planned to do at the Somme. And so it became, for the most part, a British attack with some French units on the southern end of the battlefield in support. There was a week-long artillery bombardment that was intended to cut holes in the German barbed wire and destroy defenses, and so many of the British expected it would be a walk into the German lines that day, but it was anything but. Now, when we're talking about an event like the Somme, where by the time that first day was over, there were nearly 60,000 British casualties, including 19,000 dead, it's easy to get lost in these big numbers as we think about something like a 20 or 25 mile wide attack. And so in order to help us understand the horror of July 1st, 1916, I want to take a look at the story of one battalion who was attacking on the north end of this long front on that horrible day. They were known as the Accrington Pals. At the outbreak of the Great War in August of 1914, the British Regular Army was not very big. It was a small but very professional force. They had about 250,000 regular troops organized into 4 regiments of guards. There was a Grenadier Regiment with 3 battalions, the Coldstream Guards with 3 battalions, the Scots Guards with 2 battalions, and the Irish Guards with 1 battalion. There were also 68 regiments of the line and a rifle brigade, which was an infantry regiment. There were 31 cavalry regiments, and then there were artillery and other support arms. Almost half of the British regular army, 74 of the 157 infantry battalions, and nearly half of the 31 cavalry regiments were stationed overseas in garrisons throughout the extensive British Empire. Now, despite the size of the British Army in 1914, Lord Kitchener, who was the British Secretary of State for War, believed that overwhelming manpower would be the key to winning the Great War. So he began to look for ways to encourage men of all classes to join the British Army. This concept flew in the face of centuries of British military tradition, in which the army had always relied on professional soldiers and had drawn its members either from the gentry for officers or for the lower classes in the case of enlisted men. General Sir Henry Rawlinson, who would go on to command the British Army at the Battle of the Somme, suggested that men would be more inclined to enlist in the army if they knew that they were going to have the opportunity to serve alongside their friends and their co-workers. And so he appealed to London stockbrokers to raise a battalion of men from the workers in the city of London to set an example for others to follow. 1,600 men enlisted in what became the 10th Battalion Royal Fusiliers, the so-called Stockbrokers Battalion. And that happened in less than a week, in late August of 1914. A few days later, the Earl of Derby decided to raise a battalion of men from Liverpool. Within 2 days, 1,500 men had joined the new battalion. Now, speaking to these men, Lord Derby said, quote, "This should be a battalion of pals, a battalion in which friends from the same office will fight shoulder to shoulder for the honor of Britain and the credit of Liverpool," end quote. Within the next few days, 3 more battalions were raised in Liverpool, forming what became the 17th, 18th, 19th, and 20th battalions of the King's Regiment. Success tends to breed success. And so, encouraged by Lord Derby's success, Lord Kitchener promoted the idea of organizing similar recruitment campaigns throughout the entire country. In just a few weeks, by the end of September 1914, more than 50 towns had formed what became known as Pals Battalions. The larger towns and cities, such as Manchester and Birmingham and London, were able to form several battalions each. Manchester, for example, raised 4 battalions in August and 4 more by November. From the perspective of the War Office, the Pals Battalions were a godsend because they relieved the strain on the recruiting structure of a suddenly expanded regular army, and they also relieved the financial strain. In September 1914, Kitchener announced that the organizers of locally raised units would have to meet the initial accommodation and other costs involved until the War Office took over their management. And so because of this policy, many of the recruits in the new Pals battalions were initially able to live at home while reporting for daily basic training in their local neighborhoods. You can see the local flavor of these Pals battalions in their names. Now, they weren't the official names. So, for example, the 13th Battalion of the York and Lancaster Regiment, which was the official name of a unit that became known as the 1st Barnsley Pals. The 16th Battalion West Yorkshire Regiment became known as the 1st Bradford Pals. So they had these official military names, but they also had their local names. And I'll just read down through some of these because they're fascinating and they tell you so much, not only about sometimes the location that they came from, but also something about what these men did for a living. So there's the Barnsley Pals, the Birmingham Pals, the Bradford Pals, the Cambridge Pals, the Durham Pals, the Edinburgh City Pals. And they had different names. For example, the 2nd Edinburgh City Pals were the Scottish Sportsmen's Battalion. The Football Battalions, yes, there were even units that were made up of men who played sports together. The 1st Football Battalion was the 17th Battalion of the Middlesex Regiment. There were 3 units of Glasgow Pals from Glasgow, Scotland. There was the Glasgow Tramways, the Glasgow Boys Brigade, and the Glasgow Commercials. Liverpool had 4 Pals units. Manchester ended up with 7. The Lonsdales were the 11th Battalion of the Border Regiment. There was the Preston Pals. There were the Public Schools Battalions. There were 5 units of those. The Scarborough Pals Battery, the Sheffield City Battalion, the St. Helens Pals, the Swansea Pals out of Wales, the Tyneside Scottish Brigade, and the Tyneside Irish Brigade, just to name a few. Accrington is a town in northern England that today has a population around 35,000. Wasn't a lot different in 1914. And it was from that small town that one of the most famous of all of the Pals Battalions was raised in the early months of the First World War in response to Lord Kitchener's call for a volunteer army. Groups of friends from all walks of life, from Accrington and its neighboring towns, enlisted together to form a battalion with a distinctively local identity. A month after the outbreak of the Great War, the Accrington Observer in Times of September 8th, 1914, reported that the War Office had accepted an offer made by the mayor of Accrington, a man named Captain John Harwood, to raise a complete battalion. When recruitment began on the 14th of September, 104 men were accepted in the first few hours. Brothers, cousins, friends, and workmates enlisted together, and by the 24th of September, the Accrington Battalion had all but reached a full strength of about 1,100 men. Now, around half of the battalion had been recruited from Accrington itself, and the majority of the remainder had been raised in neighboring towns, Burnley, Chorley, and Blackburn. Like most of the Pals battalions, the battalion spent its early months training in and around their hometown. In February 1915, they were given a magnificent send-off as they finally left Accrington for training at Carnarvon, where Lieutenant Colonel A.W. Rickman of the Northumberland Fusiliers took command of the battalion. By May, they were ready to ship out, and they moved from Carnarvon to Penkridge Bank Camp near Rugeley, where it joined the 12th, 13th, and 14th Battalions of the York and Lancaster Regiment to form what became known as the 94th Brigade of the 31st Division. They made further moves in July and September of 1915 before embarking in December for Egypt, where they were to counter a Turkish threat against the Suez Canal. Now that danger soon passed, and in the last week of February 1916, about a year and a half into the Great War, the 31st Division was ordered to France, where they were to take part in what became the joint British and French attack at a place called the Somme. General Sir Douglas Haig, who was the commander of the British forces on the Western Front, believed that a breakthrough was possible against the German forces at the Somme. The man that he tapped to lead the attack, the man in charge of the troops in the sector where the battle would take place, was Lieutenant General Sir Henry Rawlinson, who didn't share his superior officers' optimism about the possibility of a major breakthrough. He advocated for something a little more modest, known as bite and hold tactics. The plan itself called for the British Fourth Army to break through in the center, while the Third Army in the north and the Sixth Army of the French in the south made diversionary attacks. If successful, the Reserve Army, which included cavalry, would then exploit the gap and roll up the German line. Now, the problem was that the Germans had been in this position for well over a year, building their defenses. And like many ill-fated attacks, the preliminary bombardments did not have the desired effect. That preliminary bombardment began on June 24th of 1916. Haig's artillery was expected to destroy the German defenses and guns and cut the barbed wire in front of the enemy lines. When the attack itself began, there would be what was known as a creeping barrage, behind which the infantry would advance. Now, the British believed that the Germans would be so shattered by this bombardment that the infantry would be able to rush over and occupy the trenches, but they overestimated the effect of their firepower. Their guns were too thinly spread to be effective. They also planned a series of mines that they worked on for months in advance, and those too did not have the desired effect. There would be about 1.5 million artillery shells fired in that preliminary bombardment. Many of those shells, though, were shrapnel, which threw out steel balls when they exploded, and those were great against troops in the open, but they were largely ineffective against concrete dugouts, many of which were 10 to 20 feet below the surface. A lot of the shells were also defective. Some estimates have anywhere from 10 to 20% were complete duds that didn't even go off. And so the German defenses were not destroyed, and in many places the barbed wire remained uncut. The British Imperial War Museum has this amazing collection online of what they call the Voices of the First World War, in which they collect all of these quotes from men who were there on the ground when these events unfolded. And they have some quotes about this bombardment and what it was like on the ground. One of those quotes comes from a British signaller named Harry Wheeler, who wrote the following. He said, quote, "The firing was going on for weeks beforehand, on and off, and getting heavier. But the bombardment, when that started, it was what I always called the dance of hell. It was boom, 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 boom. Shells bursting all the time, guns firing, rather, all the time. It was a dance of hell, right enough. These poor boys who had to go through it, my God, I shall never get it out of my memory. Yes, the dance of hell." Cecil Lewis was a member of the Royal Flying Corps, and he described what he saw from the air. He said, quote, "When you had to go right over the lines, you see, you were midway between our guns firing and where the shells were falling. And during that period, the intensity of the bombardment was such that it was really like sort of a great broad swath of dirty-looking cotton wool laid over the ground. And so close were the shell bursts and so continuous that it wasn't just a puff here and a puff there. It was a continuous band. The whole of the ground beneath the darkening evening was just like a veil of sequins which were flashing and flashing and flashing, and each one was a gun." End quote. From the German perspective, Stephen Westman was a German army officer who lived through the receiving end of that barrage. And this is what he wrote, translated, of course, into English. Quote, "We were under incessant bombardment. Day and night, the shells, heavy and light ones, came upon us. Our dugouts crumbled. They fell upon us, and we had to dig ourselves and our comrades out. Sometimes we found them suffocated, sometimes smashed to a pulp. Soldiers in the bunkers became hysterical. They wanted to run out, and fights developed to keep them from the comparative safety of our deep bunkers. Even the rats became hysterical. They came into our flimsy shelters to seek refuge from this terrific artillery fire. We had nothing to eat, nothing to drink, but constantly shell after shell burst upon us." End quote. Specifically for their part in the attack, the objective of the 94th Brigade was to capture the hilltop fortress of Serre on the northern end of the main attack, and then form a defensive flank facing northeast and north. The attack was to be led by the 11th East Lancashires on the right, and the 12th York and Lancasters, the Sheffield City Battalion, on the left. The 13th and 14th York and Lancasters, the 1st and 2nd Barnsley Pals, were to support those two leading battalions. Facing them, Serre was held by the 169th Infantry Regiment of the German Army, the 8th Battalions. As the British preliminary bombardment unfolded, the units that were to lead the attack moved into position. The Accrington Pals were at a camp at a place called Warnemont Wood, 7 miles behind the lines, when they began their advance toward the front on the evening of June 30th. It was nearly 3 a.m. on the morning of July 1st that the lead companies of the battalion finally reached the spot at the front lines where they would launch their attack. And they found those spots to be already heavily shell damaged. You see, the buildup for the attack had not gone unnoticed by the Germans, and as daylight broke, their forward lines were pounded by enemy shell fire. I've been reading through some of the letters that were written home by men of the Accrington Pals, some of the journal entries that they had in describing these events. And so I thought I'd read a few excerpts from some of those because they really give some wonderful insight into what was going on at the ground level, what the men were thinking and experiencing for themselves. One of them is a letter that was written by Private Jack Hindle of the Accrington Pals, and it was published in the Accrington Observer and Times on the 22nd of July, 1916. He said, quote, "On Friday, the last day of June, we were told that we were going in the trenches that night to start the attack in the morning. We did not worry, as we expected it. And you may judge how cheerful we were when I tell you that as we were going to the trenches that night, there were a lot of the RFA on the wayside, and one of our chaps would say to one of them, 'What do you want to bring back, a German helmet or an officer's wristwatch?' And this was not the only joke, as we were promising to have a drink with each other at the village we had to take. Well, at last we got to the trenches, through which we had to walk 3 miles to get to our position. And it was no joke, as the trenches were deep in mud and water. And by the time we got to our post, we were wet through. At 6:30, a terrific bombardment started, and Fritz, which was a name they used for Germans, gave us a little in return, sending all kinds of shells, including whiz-bangs, aerial torpedoes, canister shells, and rifle grenades. At 7:20, our trench mortars started, and we went over the top. I myself felt more at ease when we got over than I did in the trench, simply because I had a chance of firing back. At 7:30, the bombardment lifted to the German second line, and we looked for someone to lead us. But all the officers and NCOs seemed to have been put out of action, and while we were waiting, which was only a matter of seconds, the Germans came out." End quote. Private Walter Pert wrote a letter to his brother and sister that was published in the Burnley Express and Advertiser, also on the 22nd of July. And here's what he wrote, quote, "We went up to the trenches on Friday night, June 30th, and after getting shelled on our way, we got in the trenches at 2 a.m. Saturday morning. Word came round that we were to go over the lid at 7:30. At 6 o'clock, a thick fog came on, and we got ready to make the attack. It got 7 o'clock, the bombardment being on all the time, and word came round that there were 20 minutes to go, boys. We were singing at the time. Word then was sent out to get our packs on. When ready, Captain Riley shouted, 'Over the top you get, boys!' And we all jumped the lid at 7:30 a.m. End quote. And Private James Henry Roberts wrote a letter that was published in August of 1916 in the Burnley Express and Advertiser. He said, quote, "Our sergeant called out 10 minutes to go. We stood in the trenches as you would stand with your head 6 inches below a wall. The Germans, were sweeping the wall or trench top with their machine guns at the rate of over 400 bullets per minute, and shells were bursting all around. 5 minutes to go, and every man ready, joking and smoking. 3 minutes to go, still they smoke and joke. And now, over you go, lads. Not a waver. We were in the last of 4 waves. And to see those waves, it was just as you would see 4 long lines of soldiers in peacetime. On we went in a steady walk. The bullets from the German machine guns just looked like one big glistening fan as they flew through the air. I marvel at us getting so near the enemy as we did. With machine guns everywhere and thousands of shells bursting, how that choir of hell sang. End quote. At 6:30 a.m., the British artillery commenced its final bombardment of the German front line before the attack. As shells were bursting on the German front trench, the men of the 3rd and 4th Companies of the German 169th Infantry Regiment scrambled from their underground shelters and brought their machine guns, rifles, and grenades ready to put them on the attacking troops. A few minutes before the attack, 19 mines exploded across the region where the attack would take place. At 7:30 a.m., the bombardment was lifted, and the leading waves of Pals battalions rose and walked in line toward the German positions. Machine gun and rifle fire immediately tore into the advancing lines of infantry. One British observer at the time likened the lines of dead to, quote, swaths of cut corn at harvest time. Now, incredible as it seems in standing there today, and it really was incredible because you can stand where the attack began and within 30 seconds walk to where it ended. That's about as far as any of them got. But groups of Pals defied the machine gun fire, threaded their way through the barbed wire, and they dropped into the German front line. On their left, some of the 12th York and Lancasters also fought their way through. But it was all in vain. Behind them, the 3rd and 4th waves suffered horrifying losses before they even reached no man's land because of the German artillery. The leading companies of the 13th York and Lancasters were cut down. Some of the Pals, their officers, killed or wounded, pressed on toward the town of Serre, and they were never seen again. Sergeant Ernest Kay of the Accrington Pals wrote a letter to his wife that was published in the Burnley Express and Advertiser on the 12th of July. And this is what he said, quote, I led my platoon in at 7:29. Captain Riley was in command of the company by 8 o'clock. There were few of us left, but although it was almost sure death, all the boys moved steadily forward, one dropping every few yards. We moved through a fearful hurricane of shot and shell. Captain Riley is gone. A real gentleman. I'm afraid there's a lot more, too. I got up to the wire in front of the Germans' front line, and I got my first hit. A piece of shrapnel or bullet right through my forearm, clean through. But not at all bad. I could use my arm. I got down and waited for my men to come up, but I couldn't see any. I crept up nearer to the German lines. I wanted to get close enough to drop a few bombs in their trench, but had not gone far before I got put out for a bit with one in the back. I thought it had finished me. I told a fellow so next to me. It was one in the back and took away all feeling. I thought it had touched my backbone, but happily the use came back in a few minutes. But this was a very lucky escape, as the shot went clean through the pack on my back and missed the spine by just a fraction. The next wound was just a bit of shrapnel in the shoulder. Nothing to speak of. End quote. Private John Hindle wrote a letter to a Mr. and Mrs. Eiley about their son James. And this is what he said, quote, "I am proud to say your son was one of my platoon, and he died like a hero. I was wounded on the same day as Jim, and as I was crawling back to our lines after being hit, I saw your son trying to work a machine gun on his own. He was badly hit then and bleeding on the head, so I tried to persuade him to go along with me, but he would not do so. He said there was no one to look after the gun and he could not leave it. I gave him a drink and he said he was all right. Whether it was that wound which caused his death or whether he was hit again afterwards, I cannot say. But you can always say he was a son to be proud of, and a son who stuck to his gun to the last. He was a good Catholic, and received both absolution and Holy Communion along with myself before he went into the trenches." End quote. By 8 a.m., just about 30 minutes into the fight, the battle for Serre was effectively over. The history of the East Lancashire Regiment in the Great War records that out of some 720 Accrington Pals who took part in that attack, 584 were killed, wounded, or missing in the span of about a half hour. Brigadier General H.C. Reese, who commanded the 94th Brigade that day, said, quote, "The result of the high explosive shells, shrapnel, machine gun fire, and rifle fire was such that hardly any of our men even reached the German front trench. The lines which advanced in such admirable order melted away under fire. Yet not a man wavered, broke the ranks, or attempted to go back. I have never seen, indeed could never have imagined such a magnificent display of gallantry, discipline, and determination." Back home in England, the initial accounts were of success on the Somme, including an erroneous report that the Accrington Pals had actually taken the town of Serre. But very soon, those reports gave way to the truth. Edith Roughsedge was an 8-year-old girl living with her parents in their fish and chip shop on the corner of Maudsley Street and Arnold Street in Accrington. Many years later, her sister, Annie, told the story of what Edith experienced that day. She said a troop train, very possibly carrying wounded soldiers back from the Somme, came to a halt on the elevated track at the north end of Horn Street. Windows were opened, and soldiers called down to the women in Horn Street asking them where they were. On hearing the reply, Accrington, they called out, "Accrington Pals. They've been wiped out." The distraught women ran with the news to the nearest open premises, which was Edith's parents' shop, where the lunchtime trade was just beginning. Edith was there to hear the story, while her younger sister Annie was only aware that a commotion was taking place in the shop. Annie said that these events weighed so heavily on Edith's mind in her childhood that as an adult she wouldn't even speak of it, and because of that became a lifelong pacifist. The unfortunate reality of these Pals Battalions now sets in. What seemed like a great idea at the time to have men who came from the same street and the same neighborhood and the same workplace fight side by side now showed the true horror of that decision, because one single battalion in one single attack, losing almost every man. There couldn't have been a family that wasn't affected in some way by what happened that morning. Percy Holmes, who was the brother of one of the original Pals, recalled, quote, "I remember when the news came through to Accrington that the Pals had been wiped out. I don't think there was a street in Accrington that didn't have their blinds drawn, and the bell at Christ Church tolled all the day." End quote. Sergeant John William Streets was a member of the Sheffield Pals, who were part of the attack on Serre that morning. He was also a poet. He wrote these words, quote, "Behind that long and lonely trenched line, to which men come and go, where brave men die, there is a yet unmarked and unknown shrine, a broken plot, a soldier's cemetery." End quote. Sergeant Streets was killed in the attack on Serre the morning of July 1st. His body lay in no man's land, as did thousands of others, for almost a year before he was recovered and eventually buried in the Euston Road Cemetery. He was 31 years old. I had the opportunity to visit the Euston Road Cemetery as well as the site of the Pals attack on Serre, and I have to tell you, I've been in hundreds of historic locations in my life. I've been on dozens of major battlefields, and I have never in my life stood in a place where I felt more the weight of the horror of war than I did standing in that field where the men of the Accrington Pals attacked. I shouldn't even say attacked, because it wasn't an attack. It was a slaughter. They made it maybe 100 yards, most of them. It's unthinkable to us today that men would be willing to even do something like that, but they did. Men like Sergeant Streets, they did it. They did it because of a sense of honor, a sense of duty to their king, to their country, because they didn't want to let the guy down next to him. They did it because they were drafted and didn't have a choice. Whatever the case may be, they did it. Sergeant Streets wrote a number of poems in his life, and about the time his body was recovered and buried at Euston Road Cemetery, one of the poems he wrote was posthumously published under the title The Undying Splendor. And I want to close this podcast with his words. "Reach out thy hands, thy spirit's hands to me, and pluck the youth, the magic from my heart. Magic of dreams whose sensibility is plumed like the light, visions that start, mad pressure in the blood, desire that thrills, the soul mad with delight to yearning wed. All slothfulness of life draw from its bed, the soul of dawn across the twilight hills. Reach out thy hands, O Spirit, till I feel that I am fully thine, for I shall live in the proud consciousness that thou dost give. And if thy twilight fingers round me steal and draw me unto death, thy votary am I, O life. Reach out thy hands to me."